Good evening, everybody. I'm very pleased to see you here all again for another lecture in the series of lectures that we have from our research lab. The Liebling House is a joint project of the Tel Aviv municipality, the engineering department, particularly of the Tel Aviv municipality, and the German government, informed of the Interior Ministry. We are a center dealing with architecture, urbanism, and conservation. Please come and visit us, I hope next week when we're open. And I'm very pleased to bring you within this research lab weekly topics that we find relevant to the contemporary discourse of architecture, urbanism, and conservation. Today, I'm very, very honored to have a special guest, actually two special guests, but our keynote speaker for today is Ita Heinze Greenberg. She's an Emerita from the ETH School of Architecture in Zurich, the Department of Theory and Architecture. 20 years ago, she actually has been teaching in Israel for over 30 years in Bezalel and the Technion. And for me, Ita is like the specialist that deals with modernism in mandatory Palestine, and in particular, of course, Erich Mendelssohn in his legacy. And before I give the stage to Ita, I wanted to tell you my own thoughts about what we're going to hear, because I think that one cannot really grasp this the depths of modernity and this sort of vernacular adaptation of this kind of international style to local conditions of climate and culture without really understanding Erich Mendelssohn and his role within this adaptation of architecture to mandatory Palestine at that time. Just to say that although we always say that Tel Aviv was highly influenced by Mendelssohn in the sort of dynamic functionalism and his curved sort of plastery way of doing monuments, even, I always say that, you know, if you look at the Einstein Tower that he's built, it looks like a 3D model to me. It's unbelievable that it's really a building. But this sort of fluidity he also brought indirectly to Tel Aviv, because we really see this kind of round balconies and these sort of very plastic forms, dynamic plastic forms. But Erich Mendelssohn has not built in Tel Aviv. Once there was a thought that he has built a school in Tel Aviv, but we do not know for sure if it's him or a worker that has been working in his firm. So I want to still emphasize that there is a direct connection of Mendelssohn's legacy also to Tel Aviv, although this is not the topic of today. But, you know, as the Liebling Center is also dealing with the urban legacy of Tel Aviv, it's important for me to state that. So I don't want to say so much because we have so many more interesting persons to speak to. So Ita, you will start, and we will follow a conversation with Alona Ntzan-Shiftán. She's the professor of architecture and town planning at the Technion and head of the Arisson Built Heritage and Research Center in Jerusalem, seizing Jerusalem, the architecture of, I think you're going to have to explain it better. Yes, Unification was a book that she wrote and was highly praised and got a lot of prizes, but I'm sorry, Alana, for not knowing a lot about it. So when we speak together later, please tell us about this book, because I think it's very important for us to hear it as well. So everybody that is listening, please post your questions on the chat. We will have about 40 to 45 minutes of a lecture, and then we'll have a conversation with Alona, Ita, and questions by you, audience. So please feel free to really engage here with this subject. Ita, the stage is yours. Thank you. You are on mute. You are muted.
Okay.
Yes.
Now it's fine?
Yes, we can hear you.
So, Sharon, thank you very much for the nice introduction and also for the invitation to speak in Tel Aviv this evening. And I'm also very happy to have Alona on board because she's also a specialist on Mendelssohn. And we met actually many years ago at the Technion on the platform of Mendelssohn and had a lot of discussions. I think this was 20 years ago, something like this. So, okay, and I will try now to put my PowerPoint presentation and you tell me if this is working.
Yes, perfect, Ita.
Okay, yeah, okay, great. Okay, Mendelssohn was probably, Erich Mendelssohn was probably among all those immigrating architects during the 20s and 30s to Palestine, Mandat, Palestine, the most established and the most famous with lots of international reputation. And when he came, just a minute, does this work? It doesn't, sorry, it doesn't, okay. So when he came, that was in autumn 1934 that he came to Mandat, Palestine. And so he was immediately met by the young Tel Avivian architects who had formed a chuk, that's how they called it, and they also published a journal called Habinyan, and they asked him to send them some lines with his impressions in Palestine. So I read you what he said, because this is the very beginning of Mendelssohn's being in Mandat, Palestine, and starting to work. So what he wrote was, the principal hope of the Jewish people is the building of its national home in Palestine. A great part of this building is of an economical character. The world, however, will not judge us by the amount of citrus fruit exported, but by the spiritual value of our spiritual contributions. The spiritual activity finds expression, first of all, in the architectural aspect of our towns. The world wants to praise, and the world has praise only where a strong will creates form and technique of a great degree of perfection. This creative perfection depends on two factors, the building owner and the architect. Our hope shall be fulfilled only then when both sides will show courage and a feeling of responsibility. Then only will our acts become eternal and will be a model for the universe. Not less than that. Your journal, gentlemen, will have to report upon the development of this work. You have to educate our people. In that event, you have undertaken a very important task. You can see here already that Mendelssohn used grand words and lofty aspirations. And we will see if he gets up to that. I will, in my small talk, this is the structure of my small talk. I will first of all start with biographical notes and then put the focus on different topics. The first will be Judaism and Zionism, the second, the Mediterranean, and the last, critical regionalism. And I'll start with some biographical notes. Mendelssohn was born in Allenstein, which is East Prussia and belongs today to Poland. He studied architecture at the Technical High School Munich with Professor Theodor Fischer. He finished his diploma in 1912. Then he started right away to be a freelance. And then when the First World War started, he did his military service on the Eastern and on the Western Front for more than 3 years. Coming back from the military service, from the war, he opened his own office in Berlin. That was in 1919. And until 1933, he had numerous commissions in Germany and beyond Germany, in Mandate Palestine, in the Soviet Union, in Norway, and in Spain. So you can see already that he had he was a figure of international reputation. And his office at that time was one of the biggest, one can say, even in Europe, with sometimes he had up to 40 assistants in his office in Berlin. On the last day of March, which was one day before the boycott against Jews in Germany, Mendelssohn escaped from Germany to Amsterdam, where he lived for some weeks or months with his Dutch colleague Hendrikus Theodorus Weidewelt. The end of 1933, he founded his own architectural office in London together with Serge Chermayev. Some months later, or a year later, almost a year later, he opened a second office in Jerusalem. And until 1939, he commuted between these two places, sometimes using the ships and sometimes even the airplane. And you can imagine that these were long journeys. In 1939, with the beginning of the Second World War, he closed his London office and dissolved his partnership with Serge Chermayev, and he moved to Jerusalem. 2 years later, or 1.5 years later, he left Mandate Palestine for America, and the first few years he lived in New York and close to New York, and then he relocated to San Francisco in 1945. And when he obtained American citizenship after 6 years being in America, he opened his own office in San Francisco, and was mainly focusing on the design and construction of synagogues. All in all, he designed he planned 7 synagogues. 5 of them were carried out. In 1943, he died in San Francisco. What I didn't say here was, maybe I should mention this, that he, in 1923, he lost his left eye. So he was, during all those years, an architect who had only one eye and and always tried to compensate this. I think so. You can see this in his sketches. They are very, very wide angle sketches, and this is kind of compensation for probably having some problems with perspective seeing. And also what I didn't mention here is that he worked for 2 years together with Richard Neutra when Richard Neutra was still very young, and before he went to America. That was from 1921 to 23. So this is a very short overview, and I would like to focus here on a few main points in his German work before we continue with his work in Mandate Palestine. Mendelssohn's breakthrough came during the First World War. in the trenches on the Russian and during the last months of the war at the French front, he produced the sketches that distinguished him as a revolutionary visionary, and that many architectural historians considered the best and most important achievement of Mendelssohn. They are prospects of a young architect who dreamt of the seemingly unlimited possibilities offered by the new building materials, iron and concrete. Starting from their elastic and plastic qualities, he tried to create a completely new revolutionary architectural language. The fact that he developed it in the extreme physical and psychological situation as a front soldier in the shelters explains psychologically the radical nature of his designs. In order to put them on paper, Mendelssohn needed to transfer himself away from reality into another sphere, and likewise his sketched architectures appear. The dimensions of the buildings captured on small format show great formats in completely new ways. The old laws of support and load are suspended in favor of a new monolithic shell architecture of sculptural quality or monumental iron constructions in the purest machine aesthetics. The themes are corresponding: car factories, aircraft hangars, harbor buildings, factory halls, railway stations, grain silos, cargo halls, observatories. With these architectural sketches, the young Mendelssohn set out on paths that no one had taken before him, and that were just as new as Wassily Kandinsky's path into abstraction or Arnold Schönberg's forest into atonality. When Mendelssohn came back from the war, he exhibited his sketches at the famous Paul Cassirer Gallery in Berlin. And I brought you here only 3 examples, and you can see from the sketches that the sketch above is to be thought as architecture in concrete, and the lower ones are using the new material steel in a very, very specific way. Mendelssohn's first built sketch, that's how I always call it, is the Einstein Tower. And it's a manifest to science, and it's a manifest to, or it became a manifest to Albert Einstein when he received the Nobel Prize for Physics in 2021. Mendelssohn here really tried to transform his visions that he had sketched during the years before into reality. And he tried to get the utmost out of the concrete and treated it like plasticine. Einstein's comment to this building was just organic. However, the whole building became a complete disaster for Mendelssohn because he couldn't, the building industry was not ready to bend concrete in this way. So half of the tower is actually built from bricks and covered with plaster as if it was built from concrete. So after this dreadful experience with curved surfaces, the architect took the turn into right-angled modernism and switched to more conventional building structures and constructions. And I brought you here also a quotation from a lecture by Mendelssohn, where he speaks about this symbolism that is behind this building. So he says, ever since science has come to realize that the 2 concepts, matter and energy, formerly kept rigidly apart, are merely different states of the primary element, that in the order of the world, nothing takes place without relativity to the cosmos, without relationship of the whole. The engineer has abandoned the mechanical theory of dead matter and has reaffirmed his allegiance to nature. So you see again, really big words, but this is Mendelssohn, and this is where Mendelssohn also stands, and you have to understand that this was also a request that he had for himself. This it was a huge demand that he had for himself also. Now I show you only very few of the buildings he erected afterwards, and he became Mendelssohn became famous especially for his department stores in Germany. He built 2 handful or a dozen of department stores in Germany, and also beyond Germany. For example, in Oslo there is a department store, or in the Czech Republic, and so on. And you can see, of course, that he went far away from his ideas that were behind the Einstein Tower, but he still keeps this dynamic. He calls it dynamic function, dynamic functionalism. Meaning long floating window bands, curved facades, swinging staircase, and so on. Actually, elements that, as Sharon already said, you find in Tel Aviv, and they became like an earworm, yeah, of music that you all the time hear again and again, and you cannot get rid of it. And this Mendelssohn's architecture became like this. Mendelssohn himself said good architecture is designed around the corner, and movement was always very important for him, even almost more important than the element of space. So that of the 2 coordinates, time and space, time is truly emphasized in Mendelssohn's architecture. One of the, yeah, okay, and now we come to one of his last projects in Germany, and that is his own home in Berlin. And I wanted to talk about this a little bit because it also is connected to Mendelssohn's feeling at home in Germany. The successful architect of the Einstein Tower and the prestigious department stores in Berlin, Stuttgart, Chemnitz, Breslau, and so on, lived with his wife and daughter for years very modestly in 1, later 3 rented rooms of a private hotel in Berlin. Behind the spatial and social limitations, which were initially certainly adapted to the young architect's small budget, stood a holistic program. With a romantic undertone, Mendelssohn advocated an ascetic living style as a prerequisite for the freedom of the mind. I quote him from a letter to his wife. To me, the spiritual life I yearn for seems possible only in the restriction of the external way of life. And he continued, to the artist, such life alone can mean creative future because it requires only minimal forces and leaves all the spiritual power free for the work. Quotation end. In addition, Mendelssohn distrusted Germany as a safe place to live. He said once, we Jews are used to looking at developments in our homeland with binoculars. Quotation end. A certain distance guaranteed to sharpen the focus. Under precarious conditions, a stable home could turn out to be a ballast that obstructs an unhindered outlook. And yet, despite artistic ideals and political concerns, Mendelssohn dreamt all the years in Germany about building his own house as a business card, as a ticket to Berlin's high society, as a demonstration of modern living, as an established home in a homeland, and not at least as showing what Jewish life in Germany could mean. All this materialized according to Mendelssohn's highest standards in the house he built in Berlin-Charlottenburg am Rupenhorn. The building plans were submitted end of July 28. In March 1930, the house was inspected by the building authorities, and in late summer 1930, the Mendelssohns could move into their house. And what is very interesting, already a year after they moved into the house, Mendelssohn, the house became a burdensome for him. So he wrote to his wife, "I sense emptiness in our house, whose solid existence limits and oppresses me." In November 1931, Mendelssohn's adverse perception of this immobilia, that's a German word, immobile, and its limitations certainly stood under the impression of growing political anti-Semitism. And when he and his wife, a year and a half later, in the first days of spring 33, turned their back on their country of birth, Germany, forever, leaving the house am Rupenhorn behind, did not seem to have been as difficult for them as one might assume. In the reflections that preceded this decision, Mendelssohn recalled the, I quote, saying of the old Jews that this is also for the good which at first appears to be suffering. More than ever, in the dangerous times of our present life, I feel destiny's sweet heaviness of being Jewish, quotation end. Under this premise, he interpreted the abandonment of an established lifestyle in the noble Rupenhorn as a welcomed liberation from static property and a return to creative mobility. I quote again, "Better to start from scratch again than refusing to think about the end. Better to ride over meadows than standing in a luxury stable forever." Quotation end. I show here the letters that came after he had left already Germany, that excluded him from different professional associations, like the Association of German Architects on the left, and the Werkbund and the Academy of Art. Mendelssohn certainly did not welcome the circumstances that made him leave his home, but he greeted the occasion of a new start. Instead of staying, he and his wife chose the immediate emigration, which marked the beginning of his wanderings from Berlin to Amsterdam, from there to the Côte d'Azur for a brief intermezzo, then to London, and shortly afterwards to Jerusalem, commuting back and forth between two parallel offices, followed by a few years in New York to finally settle in San Francisco, where he lived and worked for the last 7 years. He never again had the chance to build his own house for himself and his wife. Maybe he even preferred the permanent tenant status. Am Rupenhorn, however, remained the reference and benchmark for all subsequent private houses he realized for various clients in different places of the world. He also never set foot again in the country of the perpetrators, and refused in general any contact with Germans, with some exceptions, of course. So, for example, the annual famous Darmstädter Gespräche, the Darmstadt talks, which started in 1950, aimed at a spiritual renewal of Germany after the barbarism of the war. The second talk round under the header Man and Space became famous due to Martin Heidegger's paper Building, Dwelling, Thinking. The organizers had invited Mendelssohn to participate in the accompanying exhibition. However, their hopes for a fast forgetting and easy reparation were disappointed by his answer, which did not shy away from a sharp accusation. I quote him, "As long as Germany lacks the courage for the insight to or the insight to publicly extirpate the anti-cultural things that have occurred in its name and with its silent acquiescence, I, as a Jew, cannot contribute to the cultural significance of your country. That was his answer. I come to my next paragraph, which is Judaism and Zionism and Mendelssohn's approach to both. Domestic everyday life was not specifically Jewish at Mendelssohn's home, but rather patriotically German. The characterization as a loyal Reich citizen of Jewish confession that applies to the majority of German Jews may be apt. Of the 5 Mendelssohn siblings, only Arík was to establish loose connections to the Zionist movement during his student days in Berlin and Munich. Louise Mendelssohn wrote in her recollections that her husband had enjoyed a Jewish education with an emphasis on biblical studies and the Hebrew language. However, concerning his linguistic proficiency, it may be assumed that he acquired little more than necessary for the bar mitzvah. During his years in British Mandate Palestine, he certainly improved his command of Hebrew. In any case, Mendelssohn was proud of his Jewishness. Rabbi Armand Cohen's later assessment that Mendelssohn, I quote, was a Jew not merely by accident of birth, but by deepest conviction, is certainly appropriate. And he added, he was not an observing Jew and he was not a traditionalist in any sense, nor could he accept dogma, quotation end. Mendelssohn was sympathetic to the Zionist movement. One of his close friends from student times was Kurt Blumenfeld, who served as secretary, later as president of the Zionist Federation in Germany. In times of good income, Mendelssohn also supported the movement financially. Some house concerts at Am Ropenhorn, in which Albert Einstein played the second violin alongside Louise Mendelssohn and prominent musicians like Lily Krauss and Alice Ehlers, were organized as benefit events for the Zionist organization. Louise Mendelssohn, who had an anti-Zionist upbringing, joined her husband in his admiration for the constructive approach of Zionism. That's how he called it. In its aim to establish a self-determined Jewish state, Mendelssohn saw an attempt to overcome the Jewish dilemma, which had expressed itself for centuries in wailing and lamenting. This is how he expressed it. An important reference for Mendelssohn became Martin Buber. During the First World War, he read his published 3 speeches on Judaism, which the religious philosopher had given in Prague between 1909 and 11. They represent Buber's early efforts to combine Hasidism and Zionism and to generate a new approach to Judaism. In his account on dualism and its overcoming through creative action, Mendelssohn found the understanding of his own Jewishness. Here, the young architect read sentences that became important for him throughout all his life and work. I quote from, this is from Buber, one of the lectures: Judaism is not simple-minded and ambiguous, but full of contradiction. It is a polar phenomenon. Open the great document of Jewish antiquity wherever you want. One will find everywhere the feeling and experience of duality, and everywhere the striving for unity. It is the quest for unity that lit the creative forces in the Jew. The creative Jews are the victories over duality, their positive overcoming, the yes or the no, over the no, the creation over the despair, the triumph of yearning. Sorry. Mendelssohn was always and almost obsessively trying for synthesis. Wolfgang, in Palestine, he spoke always about the East-West synthesis, but he always built this kind of synthesis that made Wolfgang Pint, his architectural historian, speculate that Mendelssohn consciously arranged the world into reconcilable opposites and subsequently found his solution based on the dialectical process. But Pint did not read Buber. Buber not only confirmed Mendelssohn's understanding of Judaism, but perhaps more important for him at that early stage, his self-conception as an artist. His Jewishness and his artistic creativity, both essential in fomenting his identity, suddenly intertwined, obtained a common denominator. The interpretation of Judaism, which declared the creative act rather than the passive phase imperative, was a revelation to Mendelssohn. It included the call to man to participate in creation in the likeness of God. What is very interesting is the fact that these readings, and he discusses these ideas of Buber very long in the letters he sent to his young wife, Louise. This occurs parallel to his first sketches. So he reads Buber in, when was it, in 15, and writes about him. And his very first sketches from the trenches date from 1914. So this creativity, and that the definition of creativity in the likeness of God, or to fulfill the command, the divine command, was something he took very serious. And later, and he himself saw his early sketches in the realm of Jewish origin. So I quote here a letter to Kurt Blumenfeld from 1933, where he said, "What I have produced, especially my outbursts of imagination in sketches and preliminary projects, got its strength from the biblical simplicity which fulfills itself and embraces the world at the same time. I know that the inimitable quality of my first constructions is of Jewish origin, an early insight that caused me already as a young man to spontaneously see the necessity of Dionism, the only way to find ourselves and be truly creative." So you see that here everything intertwines: Jewishness, Judaism, Zionism, work, and creative work and self-understanding. Then I show you here some more of these early sketches. And they are all free sketches, although you see that they are meant to be translated into real buildings, but there was no building commission behind them. They are really visionary sketches. Bruno Zevi, who is maybe the greatest scholar on Erich Mendelssohn, and the very first one to publish him extensively, he saw in Mendelssohn the only revolutionary of his generation who would deconstruct golden calves. And I brought you here a quotation from his book, Hebraism and the Concept of Space-Time in Art, where he says, "Hebraism in art chose to manifest itself chiefly along expressionist lines. Expressionism was the only movement determined to demolish all aesthetic and linguistic taboos. Architectural expressionism found its major exponent in Erich Mendelssohn, whose buildings and visions seem to spring free by telluric motion from lava-like boiling substance rising from the earth itself, propelled by its own force and caught in the instant of its dramatic self-making. The aspect of self-making is also very interestingly to be seen in this middle sketch on the left side, where you see this, oh, now I'm missing the word, where you see this crane, I think, which seems to build the building by itself. Yeah, Bruno Zevi. Here you have in the middle you have his most famous book, and also his first publication on architectural history, Saper vedere l'architettura, which is to know how to look on architecture. It was he published it in 1948, and it was probably the very first book on architectural history that was translated into Hebrew in 1957, and it has a foreword by Martin Buber, and this foreword, it's a very short, quite short foreword, and in this foreword, Buber speaks about architecture. Nowadays we also have a translation into English. Rachel Rappaport and Judy Loach, they wrote a big article on this foreword, and they translated it into English, which is not very easy because it has a very, very dense language. So Buber's short foreword is one of the rare examples where the philosopher refers to architecture. Buber attributes to architecture the grand task of humanizing space. That's how he calls it. He views the experience of the cosmos endlessness, which reflects God's infinity, as essentially unbearable to mankind. Buber describes it as cruel and awesome. It is the task of man to create his own limited space, and by doing so to cope with the world in which he was placed. The buildings of humans do not imitate existing natural forms, but emanate from imagination alone. Thus, man overrides the terrifying endlessness of God's space with his own creations in order to give it a spirit of friendliness, humanization. That's, yeah. In contrast to a quotation end. In contrast to the other arts, Buber conceives architecture as an invasion of space itself, which can only be experienced by passing through it, meaning by one's own movement. From this, Buber deduces a specific way of looking at architecture, and he puts this into one sentence. Architecture demands from us a particular way of seeing. It demands a fusion of outlooks and a synthetic view. And you have here so many words that and descriptions that fit also to Mendelssohn, to his own understanding of architecture. So for Bruno Zevi and for his approach to architecture, and especially in his book Judaism and Architecture, published in '93, this is based on Martin Buber's ideas on architecture and the dialogical principle also, and it is based on the work of a Norwegian theologist, Thorleif Boman, Hebrew thought compared with Greek. And so if you have the possibility to have a look into this Hebraismo e Architektur, which is also now translated to English, it is very interesting and worthwhile reading. The Buberian dialogical principle, so essential to Mendelssohn's self-conception as a Jew, as an artist, is also key to understanding his ideal approach to design and his working practices in architecture. I did here a contrasting comparison with Mies van der Rohe, which is not all built by myself, but I took this from different authors. You see Bruno Zewi, Norris Kelly Smith, and Julius Bosner and Louis Mumford, who liked to compare Mies van der Rohe's approach to architecture with Erich Mendelssohn's approach. You see here that maybe I read my nice sentences. A contrasting comparison with Mies van der Rohe's method may help to clarify Mendelssohn's modus operandi. For Mies, the creative process unfolded as a concentration on himself, a listening inside himself in absolute seclusion and loneliness, waiting for the idea to develop slowly from its deepest core. Mendelssohn, on the other hand, sought active engagement with his counterpart, be it a person, for example, the client, or be it the construction specification, planning factors such as function, climate, or topography. The continuous dialogue between different poles inspired him to constantly develop new synthetic solutions, while for Mies, the final result, the slowly peeled out definite form, characterizes the process. For Mendelssohn is the encounter that leads to revelation. Mies' architecture can be described in terms such as absolute, mathematical, abstract, contextless, international. Mendelssohn's buildings invite adjectives such as dynamic, organic, regional, dialogic to express their particular nature. Mendelssohn's oeuvre lacks the homogeneity that distinguishes Mies' work. If the basic conditions change, the solutions change. In this context, architectural historians such as Norris Kelly Smith and Bruno Zewi have referred Mendelssohn's mode to the Hebrew tradition of flexible and synthetic thinking, in which absolute objective being does not exist. Being is always related. Indeed, it is expressed solely by its quality, its effect, its movement, or by the nature of its material. In contrast to this stance, the formal purity and purposeless objectivity of the classical tradition of Greek thought, for which Mies van der Rohe is widely regarded as the modern representative. To this chapter on Judaism and Zionism also, of course, belongs Mendelssohn's connection to Palestine, and he was in 1923. He was in Palestine, invited by Pinchas Rutenberg to design a series of power stations or a prototype. And which did not really realize. It was a very, a big conflict between Rutenberg and Mendelssohn. And other potential commissions followed. For example, a competition of a business center in Haifa, which together with Richard Neutra, Mendelssohn won the first prize, but it was also not executed. The second prize by Fritz Kornberg was instead executed. And then there was the project of the Carmel Garden City, which finally Richard Kaufmann carried out.
Also Habima, maybe?
What?
Habima in Tel Aviv, is that also something that he was?
No, he was in connection with. Yeah, you are right. He was in connection with the people. That's right. Yeah. but nothing came out of this. So there were many other links that he made during this short visit. He went, by the way, together with his colleague, his Dutch colleague, Hendrikus Beideveld, who helped him with the first design of power stations for Rutenberg. And Mendelssohn afterwards, he gave lectures in Zionist circles about Palestine as an artistic impression. So there, one of the key sentences is, as descendants of the Oriental Jewish people, we connect a more or less essential part of our existence with the soil of Palestine. Important man is, no, just a second, Palestine. No Jew who is able to understand his feelings travels through Palestine without the tragic touch with his own past, without humble hope of its rebirth. And then there is this nice postcard that that Mendelssohn sent to his first biographer, Oscar Bayer, together with Beideveld. So Mendelssohn wrote, "Dear Bayer, don't wait for anything written. The experience is beyond all expectation and needs time to be digested. Once it has, it can only strengthen what was always strong: blood, space, race, and three-dimensionality. Yours, Mendelssohn." And then there is this nice sentence by Beideveld who adds, "Dear Dr. Bayer, sent 2 Arab peasants to a European architecture school for a year and we would know what architecture is." They were both, Mendelssohn and Beideveld, they both were fascinated by Arab architecture, especially they mention again and again Abu Ghosh, which they passed on their way several times to Jerusalem. And for me, there are 2 buildings in Mendelssohn's oeuvre that are symbolic manifests, more than functional buildings. And these are the Einstein Tower and the Weizmann House. Both serve their function, laboratory and residence, but they are much more. They have superfluous features, meaning manifest to science the first, manifest to Zionism the second. The perspective program Mendelssohn designed presents the Weizmann House like a temple. He refers here to the approaching path to the Acropolis, which Mendelssohn was able to perform himself 3 years before. And also the exposed stair tower indicates significance as a public building or as a resident of a public figure, because usually Mendelssohn put these kind of staircases only in his warehouses or public buildings. So with the Weizmann House, we already approach Mandate Palestine and his work there. To understand Mendelssohn's approach to Zionism more widely, one should also take into account his immediately preceding engagement. He was together with Beideveld and Amadé aux Enfants, whom you might know as the early colleague of Le Corbusier in l'Esprit times, l'Esprit Nouveau times. So with these 2 people, with these 2 colleagues, he founded a European Mediterranean Academy in South France. And I will not go into this now. It's a fantastic story. And but it brought Mendelssohn very close to the Mediterranean and to to evaluate the Mediterranean as a unit, as a cultural, political, and aesthetic and historical unit, which widened his view on Palestine also. I will go into this soon. And on the left side, you see this ship Patria was the name of the ship. It was a French liner on the Mediterranean route between Marseille or Trieste to Jaffa and Haifa. And Mendelssohn traveled several times with this ship when on his tours between London and Jerusalem. And the first time the first time he did it together with Chaim Weizmann. And this ship is, by the way, and this is only an aside, this is the famous Patria that was in November 41, I think. It was in November 40 or 41, I'm not sure. A bomb planted by a Haganah agent blew a hole in the side of the ship's hull. She listed to the side and sank in 16 minutes. It was on board were 1,900 people, mostly refugees from Germany. Most were rescued, but between 260 and 300 were killed. And the Haganah did this in order to prevent the deportation of the refugees to Mauritius, which was planned by the British officials. So this is a very, it's a very historic, it's a ship with a very strong history, and it's also a ship with a very strong name. Patria means a fatherland. So on this ship, Mendelssohn and Weizmann traveled together in November 34 to Palestine. Mendelssohn and Weizmann had met in London, where the Weizmanns lived at that time, and they developed, Vera and Chaim Weizmann developed a plan for residence in Mandate Palestine. And they chose Mendelssohn to be the architect, so they went together in November 34 on the Patria to Jaffa, I think, yes. And you see here on the right side, you have a still from a film that we have by Ellen Auerbach. Ellen Auerbach was a young photographer, 27, I think. She was also emigrating from Germany, immigrating to Mandate Palestine with the same ship. And she made a film, a very short film, but she made a film, and it's a very rare document of these refugee ships. And of course, and she documented the entire spectrum of Jewish life that was on board of the Patria, praying Orthodox, young Hora dancing, Chalutzim, athletic youth hanging in the region, looking for land, home, displaced people huddled close together next to hopeful Zionists on the steerage, and elegantly dressed first-class passengers. And two of them, of the first-class passengers, were Chaim Weizmann and Mendelssohn. So I think that so they made this journey together, these two men, to inspect the site for Weizmann's future residence in Rehovot near Tel Aviv. The crossing on the Patria found its way into the memoirs of Louise Mendelssohn, who accompanied her husband. She describes the time on board together with Weizmann as very intense and inspiring. Her description of the care he gave the immigrants in the crowded steerage is very vivid. And planning of, this is the interesting point, the planning of the Weizmann house actually began on the Patria. So you have this fatherland, Patria, and you have one of the most important clients that you could have, at that time, Chaim Weizmann, at that time the head of the World Zionist organization. And and they have this intense 5 days from Marseille, they travel to Jaffa and they start planning the Weizmann house. And I think that the house clearly references nautical motifs. The straight symmetrical hierarchy of flat blocks is reminiscent of the longitudinal section of a ship's hull. A semicircular sweeping stair tower with a band of windows running around the top suggests a captain's bridge, and rows of round oculi windows evoke the portholes of large ships. The inhabitants of Rehovot, it is said, perceived Villa Weizmann as a steamer on a vast ocean of swaying orange trees. The image of the ship triggers certain associations: departure, travel to distant destination, escape and rescue, movements toward a definite or indefinite destination, hope for a brave new world. The archaic basic motive for all these images is Noah's Ark, which is given a modern form with Zionist connotations in Mendelssohn's Weizmann house. It has arrived on Mount Ararat loaded with all hopes for a better society in a new home. I show you these pictures. You see the Mosse building and you see Columbus House and pavilion for a fair, and the Delavar pavilion in Bexhill-on-Sea, and they all have nautical elements, railings, and so this is not new in Mendelssohn's oeuvre, but I still think that the Villa Weizmann refers to this experience on the Patria and brings this into the Zionist realm. And it was not only the ship, but it was also the Mediterranean that was always a place of well-being to Mendelssohn. This went far beyond its recreational factor into the depths of a fundamental feeling of home and secureness. I quote him: "The sea of eternal wandering, the Mediterranean bears me." The sea was his element. The eternal flux of the waves was his beloved theme, a symbol of his dynamic approach to architecture as well as to the currents of his life. The ambivalent dynamic of the sea as a moved and moving energy was his constant point of reference, an origin to which he returned again and again. Many of his letters to his wife Louise indulged in maritime themes or used the game of the waves as a metaphor. Time and time again, it was the Mediterranean Sea which nurtured his nostalgia that has been, and I quote him again, "nostalgia that has been with me since I was a child and which has carried me through time, which gives meaning to my awareness of space, to the harmony of mass, to the relation of each part to the whole, to the equilibrium of the three dimensions." Quotation end. Migration itself became a fluid process. That's how Mendelssohn conceived it. From Jerusalem, he wrote to his wife Louise, "Water is my element. I carry you to dry land. We have only islands. They are divine in the blue sea, unreal in the fog, real life within the unknown, limited within infinity, we alone." These hymns to the azure of the eternally moving and moved sea ran throughout his life through like a blue stream. But it was also it was the sea, but it was also the surrounding countries and their culture that interested Mendelssohn very much, and that he took into consideration in his newly formulated architecture in Palestine, which was so different than his work in Germany. When Julius Posner, who some of you might know him, he's an architectural critic, and he had worked with for Mendelssohn very short time in Berlin, and then he was in Paris and came to Palestine in 1934 at the invitation of Erich Mendelssohn, and Mendelssohn attached a condition to a position in his office, which Posner later recalled as follows, I quote, "Mendelssohn told me how I should travel. Since I did not know the Orient, I could not simply take a ship from Marseille or Trieste to Haifa. I had to see Constantinople, Asia Minor, Syria, that is, I had to take the land route from the Bosporus. Otherwise, I would be of no use to him," quotation end. The travel advice to Posner, he, by the way, did not follow it, characterizes Mendelssohn's approach. His method was phenomenological. Understanding took place through perception. Before coming to Palestine himself, he had intensively studied the culture and history of the Mediterranean in the context of the European Mediterranean Academy project on the French Riviera. This brought him into contact with French modernism especially, and with the Mediterranean thought of Paul Valéry, for example. And I have one quotation here from one of the publications of Paul Valéry on the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean world, in which the historical authority of antiquity is always to be remembered, played a growing role for Mendelssohn. The perception of continuity, what the French call the longue durée, the aesthetics of timeless beauty, and the visualization of history were aspects he took with him from his French experience to the east coast of the Mediterranean to mandate Palestine. And here again, the Weizmann house, which Mendelssohn described as, I quote, "a house absolutely of our time and yet adopted as a residence in a subtropical climate. This, I feel, is a type of home which will again, after 2000 years, become popular throughout the Orient, as it was when Judea was a Roman province. The Mediterranean diction of modern," quote end, "the Mediterranean diction of modern architecture served the paradox inherent in Zionism, which on the one hand defined itself as a new beginning at point zero, and on the other drew its claim to Palestine from a history dating back 2000 years. The coordinates of time and space meet here."
Ita, I'm sorry to disturb you, but we are already like 25 minutes past our time. So
25 minutes?
Yeah, we thought you were going to speak for 45 minutes, and it's more than an hour. So
so maybe I just, yeah. Okay, it's already an hour. Okay, so let me just maybe say very few things now and come to an end and put this together. So here my last thing was critical regionalism. Of course, critical regionalism was not yet a term invented or coined when Mendelssohn was building in Palestine, but it was coined later by Kenneth Frampton and Alex Tsonis. But it's like Mendelssohn's buildings are like critical regionalism avant la lettre. And I show here most of the buildings he did in the 7 years he worked, and he worked in Jerusalem. So above you see, on the left, you see the photo showing the Schocken house, and on the side the Schocken library, then below the Anglo-Palestine Bank, then the laboratory building at the Weizmann Institute, and on the right the Haifa government hospital that he built for the British Mandate authorities. Then down the entrance of the Hadassah hospital, and two schools. One is the agricultural school in Rehovot, and the Ludwig Tietz school, which doesn't exist anymore, at Kibbutz Yagur. And just to show two, and maybe I just show these two pictures and end with this. I compare here Mendelssohn's Anglo-Palestine Bank, which is an office building with a bank on the first floor, with the office building, the Columbus building in Berlin. And I don't have to say much, but you see right away that his dynamic approach calmed down in Palestine, and this is by purpose, of course. And also, which I find so interesting, and this is then my last comment, and maybe we start a discussion with Alona. This is, I always like to show this. It is not just by chance that the Anglo-Palestine building was photographed here by Alfred Bernheim with the two camels in front. This is a statement which says that we are here in the East, and it's a very old culture which still is alive. And this is also Mendelssohn's approach, that he says, I want to build the Bible, but still search for an East-West synthesis, meaning he always said the East is wisdom and the West is technology, and to bring both of them together and find a new platform for the future architecture of Palestine. So thank you. We are missing all the quotations now of the pamphlet he wrote before he left Palestine, but maybe we can distribute this. And I think you also in the Liebling House, you have this text, yeah?
I am not sure, but we will be very happy to have it. So if you can send it to us again, it would be great.
Okay.
Alana, can you please open your camera as well? So first of all, Ita, it was amazing and very inspiring to me the way you also sort of linked this spiritual approach of Mendelssohn to his built oeuvre, which I was not so aware of. So thank you very much for highlighting this aspect, which I find really amazing. But I would want to invite Alona for the few minutes that we have left to perhaps just reflect and from her perspective of your lecture, to your lecture. So please, Alona.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I wonder if to speak in English or in Hebrew.
In English, please. But Ita, yes, we have Jörg Kasper, for example, who was the head of the Berlin Conservation Department. He's here with us. So I think there's other English speakers. Yes.
Okay, because Ita knows Hebrew very well, but if we have other audience, yeah, we remember. So I thought that the last images were amazing, the comparison, and they said a lot in a very immediate way. I think that maybe the way to see this amazing itinerary from the local point of view relates, Sharon, to what you said at the beginning about the touch of Mendelssohn in Tel Aviv. And And Mendelssohn was actually looking with distrust, and he was quite annoyed by the idea that his European architecture was copied or quoted all over the Middle East. And he thought that these kind of sweeping round images, forms, are the way you express the movement of the modern metropolitan. And he looked for something completely different here. So, so maybe I'll just point out one thing that takes from Ita's wonderful talk, that what is so interesting in the idea that we know so little about Mendelssohn here, and is not part of the heroes, and we are talking about the architect of the state and so on. We look at architects of the next generation, while Mendelssohn was probably the modernist that built more than any other modernist in Europe or maybe worldwide during the 20s. So my point is that we have a very strong compatibility here, or reciprocity, between modern forms that are aesthetic, architectural, and modern forms that are political. And what is really interesting here, that the Ishuv during Mandate Palestine embraced mostly political Zionism. It is not by chance that Herzl's image is on top of Ben-Gurion's head when the state is declared, and pragmatic Zionism and so on. And Weizmann was actually still a cultural Zionist, and Buber was one of the leaders of cultural Zionism. And we really see here Herzl versus Ahad Ha'am in architecture. So Buber actually was not only a cultural Zionist, but he desecularized Ahad Ha'am. So he went back not to religion as a convention, but to religion as a sentiment. He talks about Jewishness, not about Jewish law or tradition and so on. So this was the way that Mendelssohn connected to it, of kind of emerging within, from the place, with the spirit of the place. And his architecture always emanates from the place. And this is the idea of this duality that Ita talked about so much, because it's the responsibility of the architect to pacify this duality and merge it into this new creation. And when it was here, it was the East and West, it was the Semitic wall that is going, according to Buber, to overcome the Western civilization, to offer an alternative, a superior alternative. And everybody that thought that is ridiculous or that is exaggerating said, look at Athens, look at this small place. They did the world revolution. They opened a new era. And what I want to do here is no less than the Parthenon. It's the turning point. And therefore, the Hebrew University was such a desired project. And everything that Ita showed at the last chunk with the regional critical regionalism in reverse, in a way, like prior to the moment, was the result of this thing. So Ita's your talk was so full with all of Mendelssohn, and his application over here was to articulate in space the architecture that didn't want the game of Zionism. In the competition of what is the most Zionist, was the most appropriate Zionist architecture, it didn't win. But it was so important that it's still celebrated, but not for its ideas, but for its appearance. So he was embraced as the architect of the international style, although this kind of statement would turn him several times in his graves because he thought that there's nothing like international style, that it's just, words without content. So it's really interesting to see how all these ideas are coming through, and to see that this architecture was not just an aesthetic appearance, but a statement, a real statement on all grounds. I don't know, Sharon, you should say.
Yes, we
are
are not on time, but I personally find this conversation very appealing, so I'm having a hard time to stop you. So we'll just keep on just a little bit more. Everybody who wants to, leave is of course welcome to do so, but I'm just wondering, you were saying that, this was not like sort of the architecture that won in the end of the day. Maybe perhaps more the Chada'am sort of statement won, but I want to reflect back to the Chug, because you mentioned it before. And in the case of Tel Aviv, we really see that it was the spirit of a lot of very young architects that came here. And perhaps, the Israeli sort of, the Jewish sort of chutzpah to say, oh, those old, architects, they're accomplished, like, there are a lot of other ones, not only Mendelssohn, but to say, no, we are young, we want to do it in our own way. And I think I even heard that most of these architects that actually built the city were under 30, So maybe I would want to ask you about this moment in time where you think that this sort of chug and the whole journalists that were spread around this chug took over this sort of more refined, more vernacular sort of approach to local architecture.
You see, the idea of this kind of compatibility between the architecture and the politics is what make it eclipse any other form. And what happened is that they were very young, and some of them studied and were trained by Mendelssohn, and they did respect him very much. He was the snobbish one. If you read what Agnon is writing about him, he was like, whoa, such a snob. He overlooked everybody. And but the thing is that the Zionist organization was also declining. It didn't have the same power that it had in the 1920s until the rise of fascism. So these young architects, they were first pioneers before they became architects. They left Palestine to Europe after they were already integrated in all these Zionist institutions. So when they came back, they were not migrants like Mendelssohn and other architects that arrived after 1933, but they were already part of the society, of its institutions and so on. So when Aryeh Sharon comes back, he's already a schmutznik, right?
Yes.
He's already a kibbutz member. He knows everybody. He knows to do it. And he's, these are the people that came earlier. They were true Zionists. They're not
refugees,
mm-hmm. Right? So even Buber, the intellectuals of Rehavia did not look very well upon his late arrival. So it's really the idea that they already had a good hold culturally, and then the big older guys came. So it's not that they didn't respect them, but they already knew how to function things. And Mendelssohn didn't agree to, he wrote a letter, and it quotes some of it. He wrote a letter to the Chugs. It was not yet a binyan, but a binyan במזרח הקרוב. And it was the Chug publication. And he basically undid every value that they believed in. They said, they were for Hebrew work. He said, no, we are Semitic among Semitics. We are Jews among Arabs, and we need this Semitic culture to overcome the West. They wanted to have a tabula rasa, to have an empty land, and he wanted to go and to be inspired. It was a reverse Orientalism. So it was exactly the opposite of what they believed. They wanted to have collectives, and he wanted to have the architect as the artist, as the leader, as the one, that he himself resolves this contradiction and hand it on to the society, while they wanted to have collective work. So it was really not only the idea of young against the old, it was more, I think, Mendelssohn refusing to accept their practice, their values, and not treating them maybe with the respect they deserve. So it's
that's true. I would also agree, partly at least, that he was very respectless towards the younger ones. Yeah. That's true, but it's not altogether true. He he criticizes Tel Aviv very much, and of course you mentioned this already, that he said one should forbid to build round balconies at least for 10 years. Yeah, but he also, so he says, Tel Aviv cuts itself off from the Arab hinterland and develops into a 100 Jewish business center with a port of its own, with its own language, its own costume. It becomes an enclave of European civilization within the Arab world that strives for unification. But then he also has praise. Tel Aviv's new residential quarters prove that the best constructive and architectural results of the modern movement have already brought about an artistic expression of their own, corresponding to the climatic conditions of the Mediterranean. So it's this, he plays with this. And of course, he had also friends in Tel Aviv, like Jakob Schiffman, who built all these schools in Tel Aviv. And he
was the city engineer, of course, that did not let anybody do eclectic buildings anymore. So maybe there was an influence as well. I just fresh news, we decided Jeremy Hoffman, the head of the conservation department of Tel Aviv, was just texting me that, and sending me a picture actually, that this Max Fein school, which was built in Tel Aviv, is actually built by Mendelssohn, because he just showed me that there is a signature. So although, he showed me the signature just now. We can send it to you. But I want to...
or the stamp? The office stamp or a signature?
Wow. I saw...
you my...
Yes, what do you know?
You my idea. I don't know if it's Mendelssohn or not, but I have the idea that it would have been a very early project, because it's dated 35, I think, this plan.
35,
and
yes.
My idea is...
I can't hear you.
Oh, I don't hear you now.
Yes, I hear you now. Now you're back.
Okay. Yeah, so what I think is that Erich Kempinski, who was the engineer in Mendelssohn's office, he was a very, very good engineer, and he had commissions by himself, and he had and I think he took this project with him into the office.
I don't know if you see it, but it's really Kempinski.
Yeah, it's Kempinski.
Yes, although it says here Erich Mendelssohn's office. So it's interesting. I don't know. I don't want to go too deep into it.
No, of course it was done in Mendelssohn's office, but it was brought by his engineer. That's what I think.
Yeah, it sounds like that. But we can have a debate about it later.
Yeah.
Anyway. I'm very sorry, but girls, that it's 9:30 and we're half an hour past our time.
Oh, I'm so sorry. It's always the same with me.
It's called passion, and we really like that. So what I wanted to please ask you, Ita, if you may just finalize this talk of ours. And Alona, thank you so much for joining. It was a pleasure, and I learned a lot, and everybody else I'm sure as well. So I hope we can continue a collaboration in one sort of another. And Ita, if you want to just complete this session, please do. But first of all, I would like to invite everybody for next week's lecture. It's a town planner, Nachum Cohen, who's going to talk to us about the 5 principles of a good city, of planning a good city. So this is next week at 8. But please, Ita, I want to have you sort of, finish off this wonderful session.
Yeah, it's very hard to finish this off because there is so much to say more, on Mendelssohn, and these were only some spotlights, And I also hate to repeat myself again and again. So for each lecture, I take out certain aspects. But what can be said is that what is interesting with Mendelssohn is, first of all, his architectural approach to Zionism, or to Mandat Palestine, or to Eretz Israel, because he also believed or wished for a state. So this is this East-West synthesis. I talked about this, and on the political side, it's very interesting because Mendelssohn was his pamphlet Palestine and the World of Tomorrow was not his first political pamphlet. He wrote several in Germany, and he also gave lectures, and he was very strongly involved in the European movement. The pan-European movement in the 20s. So he took part in conferences there because he believed in these big entities. So for his vision was that for a Semitic Commonwealth, well, Alona already said this, but and for a Semitic Commonwealth, you refer to, or he said, we should build this together with the Arabs. So it means also in the aesthetics of architecture to bring different knowledge and wisdom together. So this is a vision that is very, very grand. But and the Mediterranean, of course, is a reference that can still be very valuable for Israel today. I mean, we have this, which Sarkozy founded this Mediterranean Union, that was in the 90s, founded a bit against the dominance, the European dominance of Germany. But this is a union that brings all the neighboring countries together, and it is. And so, and Israel is a member in this union. It doesn't have any relevance right now, but this can change, of course. So these are visions that I think that they are still relevant. And in this pamphlet, he again and again refers to the Mediterranean and to the Semitic Commonwealth. So this is maybe something still.
The message to the world that we're all interconnected, and we have to keep that up, no matter if it's architecture or politics. So thank you very much for this amazing speech, and I hope to see you here soon, Ita and Alona as well. So everybody else.
The airport is not closed.
Thanks a lot. We will open it for you, Ita.
Yes.